Hello, mugwumps and muckrakers. Eric from Dead Tech here, and today I'm going to be doing another in the nascent series I have about niches and doing assessments of your niche ideas. If you don't know what I'm talking about, up above, if you click that eye that's appearing up there, ideally, if I edit this correctly, you will be able to see a playlist of these videos. But basically, the idea of the niche videos is it's really hard to kind of in the abstract walk people through on either my blog or in videos, like generally how do you find and validate a niche. So what I've done is put out kind of a call to action to say, hey, write in with your niche ideas and we'll talk through them, because I think a lot of examples and understanding what probably will work and what won't and the thinking along that is going to be helpful. So pitch aside, if you're looking around, you might be wondering what's with the change in background. I am back in Michigan as of a couple weeks ago. I was in the Florida Keys. That was a better place. But now I'm back in the land of the frozen north where, things at the moment, because I'm recording this in the middle of December and I think all restaurants here are closed and stuff. So it's a much different vibe than the Keys, and you might be wondering why I'm here. I also wonder that. In the most philosophical sense. But as it turns out, we're having a baby, my wife and I, in February, and so we kind of came to the end of the line of when we needed to be close to home for a lot of doctor's appointments, and we wanted to do that without incurring ruinous financial costs by being out of state and out of network. So here we are in Michigan instead of the Florida Keys, but hey, good fun things coming up in a couple of months, so I'm not going to complain. All right, my personal business aside, the niche idea here in question today is on the subject of code generation, which if you don't know exactly what that is, I will explain. It's kind of wonky and highly technical, so I'll cover that just enough for you to understand what's going on if you don't understand it, and then we'll dive into that as a niche idea. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. All right, let's take a look at the niche question itself. I'm going to lean over here and say, this is, my apologies, it's a little mixed in with some other stuff that we were talking about. So he says, I think the part I'm having difficulty with is figuring out what niche I would like to pursue. I have a fair bit of experience with both startups and larger companies. I could probably leverage my experience in building sustainable code generation systems as part of a development pipeline for some of them, as that translates pretty easily to cost savings and developer hours when done well. And usually well doesn't involve some random overloaded developer writing a code generator on the fly without planning. I don't know, could something like this work? All right, so first things first, a little bit of bookkeeping, or no, that's the wrong word, housekeeping. What is code generation? So code generation is, in a way, as simple as it sounds, and it's also kind of like stoner-tastic. But it's basically that you write a program that writes code. So you write code, you compile it and run it, and then that program you've written writes other code. If this sounds crazy because you haven't encountered it before, there are actually some pretty common use cases. So back in the days when I was doing a lot of consulting and traveling management consulting, evaluating code bases, you would commonly see code generation schemes employed to write what's known as boilerplate code. So object relational mapper code, a lot of plumbing code. And if you want to understand maybe the gist of what this is and what the motivation is, think of it this way. Let's say that you have what's known as a CRUD app, create, read, update, delete, or sometimes forms over data, that basically you just have these like database type concepts, and most of your application is just performing basic operations. So like take Hit Subscribe, my content business, links down below if you're interested. Hit Subscribe is in the business of creating blog posts. So in that world, you have certain domain objects like author, customer, blog post, etc. And if you're going to create a database application that models all that, like an internal line of business system for Hit Subscribe, then you're going to have, say it's a web app, you're going to have ways of adding users, create. You're going to have ways of editing them, and listing them, read, update, and you're going to be able to delete them. So that's going to be true of administrative users, of the blogs, of the authors, of the customers, of the editors, etc. So what starts to happen is the code to read that stuff out of the database, the code to display it on a web page, all of that starts to become super redundant and basically varying only by the particular fields in question. So by and large, create, read, update, and delete on a blog as an entity is going to be very similar in concept to author as an entity. So one of the solutions is to basically jumpstart your application development through code generation. So instead of hand writing all of this code and doing it over and over again, you write a program that spits out all of the boilerplate code, and then you start from there and modify it. So I'm going to set aside weighing too much into my own opinion of code generation. I'll leave it at saying I think of code generation as a tool that I look at highly skeptically for a variety of reasons. One of which is that it was one of the most common paths to a whole ton of terrible legacy code that I would see when I was doing code-based assessments. Usually some, like huge app dev body shop type place would do a bunch of code generation, spin something up, hand it over to the client, and then leave.
You stupid rabbit! Like this!
And then you had this kind of unwieldy beast that they were maintaining. But I don't want to get into that too much. Maybe 7 years ago or something, I'll put down below, I wrote a post called something like, I think code generation is a failure of vision. If you want to check out my opinions on that, feel free. But I'm not religious about it. Like, you could come to me and show me a good code generation application, like T4 templates and some of the stuff that goes on in like Entity Framework. The last time I looked at that, like, there are uses, you can pick your spots, but I think it's a tool I've seen employed more in a way that sort of blows off your own foot than in a valuable way, but that's just my opinion. So I spent several minutes just now on my opinion after saying I'm not going to get into my opinion. I've had my coffee. But the point here isn't to really dive into what I think as a technical person about code generation. It's to look at it as a niche, as an idea for a niche that could be validated or maybe not validated. So let's look at this as a niche. What do I think of it? I won't bury the lead. I think this is a really challenging niche idea. I think you're going to have a really, really hard time making a go of it and identifying a niche associated with code generation. So I would say, as far as niche ideas go, this is not a good one. That being said, it's an understandable one, so I don't want you to think that I am being overly critical about the idea of code generation as a niche. I am not. I can totally understand why you would get there. It's highly technical. There's not a lot of people that are experts in it. It has some upside done right, and you might not face a lot of competition. There's a lot to like about it. But that being said, let's take a look at why I'm saying it's not going to work well for you as a niche. So let's look at this through the lens. And this reader question, by the way, was one that I fielded as a reader question. So this was before I did the call for niche ideas. So this was just somebody tossing this out there, and I hadn't done some of the explanation that I've done on my blog. So if you'll recall, I'll find the post and link it below, but I did a post saying that you don't create niches. You don't decide on them. It's not something you just do the way you would decide to acquire a skill. A niche is something you identify and then validate. So a niche exists irrespective of whether you're filling it or anyone's filling it. It's a demand, it's a need that people have. So through that lens, if we look at code generation, not really a niche in the first place. There isn't anybody out there. There's no executive like CIO or a program director or something that's waking up and thinking, gosh, I could really use some code generation. That would be sweet. And when you have a true niche, they are thinking things like that. So for instance, and I'm just throwing this out there because it's opportunistic, but like one of the things that I'm looking for is a fractional staff counsel or a lawyer that does contract review but doesn't charge by the hour. So I'm the customer. There's a demand for that. I know that other people demand that because I'm an entrepreneurial Slack, and I asked if that existed, and there was a lot of response that was like, I don't think so, but I sure wish it did. So contract review lawyer that bills in some way other than by the hour, niche, because there are people out there demanding it. Code generation, I've literally never once heard a director or executive that I've talked to say, I really wish we had more computer generated source code. It's just not, there's not thirst or demand for it. It is really kind of more of a tactic. So once you've decided on a strategy, and you've kind of started to do a project plan, the code generation would be something you would do to get there faster, so it could help you in the pursuit of some goal that would be more like a niche. Now, in terms of your like sales and marketing and whatnot as a freelancer, let me, I have some notes over here that I wanted to talk about. Let's talk briefly about the idea of a buyer committee. I am not going to go into as much detail as I have in the past. Again, links below. I have a blog post where I lay out all the different roles in a buyer committee. But for our purposes here, there is, when you're selling your services, there is the economic buyer. This is the person with the authority to sign checks or issue purchase orders. There is the decision maker.
But I'm the decider, and I decide what is best.
And in the enterprise, sometimes that's a different person. So you might have the program CIO as the buying authority that sets budgets. And then within that budget, you've got the decision maker who might be a director that decides to bring someone like you in. Now you've got these other folks involved as well in what's called a buyer committee. You've got influencers, and that's going to be your architect, senior developers. Those are the people who can talk to the director and influence the decision about whether or not to go with the service provider. And specifically within that world, there are blockers. Those are influencers that don't like you or don't want you brought in, and there are champions. And those are the influencers that go out, maybe hear about you, read about your blog, and say, hey, we've got to bring this person in to do some work. Either one of those is kind of an instance of the abstract influencer. Now, ideally, when you're selling services, you want to be selling things right to your buyer, even bypassing the decision maker. You want to be talking to the check signer, because if you're talking to the check signer, this is some advice that you'll get if you read $1 Million Consulting, by the way, highly recommended, again, down below. If you're talking to the check signer, the influencers, blockers, champions, like none of it matters, because the check signer, if they really like what you have to say, can just sign a check. Second best is to be talking right to the decision maker. The check signer then has delegated the authority, so even though it's not the person with the budget, it's still the person who can pull the trigger. And so as best as you can, you want your sales pitch, you want your marketing, you want everything speaking to buyers, ideally, but absent that, decision makers, really not champions and other people, because that's just so indirect. It's so hard to do. And with code generation, you are by definition bypassing your buyer and decision maker and getting straight into the influencer weeds, because it's those engineers that are going to be in the thick of it with you, doing the code generation scheme, working with you, getting you access to the code base, etc. So the exec doesn't care. If you come to the exec, the buying authority, a lot of these people won't even know what code generation is, especially in the enterprise or banks. They might have come up to leadership through like manufacturing or civil engineering or something. They might never have been programmers, or if they were, it was a really long time ago, and maybe they never encountered code generation, or maybe they only are aware of it in the abstract, or maybe like me, if I were in an executive role making this decision, I know what it is. It's been a while since I used it, but I would actually have kind of a negative opinion of it, and so that's not helping things. So the point being, the execs, if they know what it is, are pretty far removed from it. So they're going to go to the decision maker, to the director, and say, I don't know, you deal with this. I don't really understand what this person is pitching. And the director is probably going to do the same thing and say, I don't know enough about this. Go talk to my architect. So you're going to get booted down the organizational chart until you're arguing with another developer about whether code generation is a good idea or not. And if you lose that argument, you're not even going to make it back up to your decision makers. So that means that as far as code generation goes, if you're trying to, I won't even say fill a niche, because it's not a niche. But if you're trying to sell that to organizations, you're going to have to sell it through individual contributors, because leadership doesn't care. And that is a really tough thing to do. The other thing you're going to find is when you're kicked down the organizational chart in terms of having those conversations, a big objection and a valid one will be that when you try to sell this to the organization, a developer on the staff is going to look at it and say, I could do that, I can do what this person's proposing. I could put together a code generation scheme. And so, yeah, you might be better and more experienced at it, but an engineering leader is going to look and say, I've got a sunk cost staff member that claims to be able to do this. I've got this other guy that claims he can do this, but I'm not currently paying for him, so it would be extra. I don't really know what these guys are talking about. This doesn't seem like something I want to touch. So again, you're really teeing up something that's a challenge here for you to sell and to market. And so that's another reason. And in the beginning, when I was talking about calling this like a bad idea, it's not that it's a bad idea from just an implementation perspective, but I'm thinking of it through the lens of establishing a practice. And it's not that it's bad, but it's sure going to be hard for you to do this. Could you do it? Could I be wrong? Yeah, it's always possible. But like, I'm just envisioning your sales conversations, and man, is that going to be a slog, because you're just going to have exec after exec saying like, I don't know.
What the f are you talking about?
Huh? No, what the f you? I'm not.
We're talking about unchecked aggression.
Talk to Joe, the engineer on my team, and if you can convince him, tell him to follow up with me in 3 weeks. And that's a really tough sales cycle. The last thing I'll say here is that the rationale for what you're doing here, what you've asked in the question, is super common, which is, what did you say in here? Cost savings and developer hours. So not only are a lot of people coming and offering cost savings and development hours, including like productivity plugins, like literally every dev tool in the world, all of these tools are offering that type of cost savings. Not only is every consultant coming in and saying like, I'm going to install Jira and everybody's, it's going to be more efficient. So everybody is already trying to do that, but developers themselves are doing that. And so everybody on the team already has an opinion that they're speaking to leadership about how we could do things more efficiently. So you're not really selling a very profound or like resonant differentiator. Okay, so having kind of pooped all over the whole idea here, my apologies for that, but I think that's necessary, and I think it's going to help with the conversation in these case studies. What could you do that would involve code generation if you are good at creating code generation schemes? And I think there are answers there, and you could, tease at and start to find and identify a niche. Not that people were demanding code generation, but that people had an actual demand or need or whatever where code generation or knowledge of code generation is valuable as part of your secret sauce and your deliverable. So let me circle back and say something important here. A lot of people come to me with niche ideas that are like skills or here's what I'm doing and I want to earn a living doing it. And usually what you're describing there is a competitive advantage or a secret sauce or your patented way of doing it. It's not the niche. So in the case of the question as presented, the niche idea would actually be not code generation, but saving developer labor. And so that's a very red ocean, but saving developer labor is the niche. The way you do it, your competitive advantage is through code generation. So I wouldn't make that play either, but it helps frame the terms. So let's look at some plays that maybe we could make. Based on my travels, if you want to become an expert or already are an expert in code generation, ironically enough, probably your best niche, the best way to approach that, I would actually suggest would be fixing code generation schemes that exist. So think in terms of legacy code, like the things that I talked about where some body shop comes in and just is able to underbid all their competitors because they've got some monstrous code generation thing they bring to bear on every project.
No, depravity you wouldn't commit.
It spits out 1 million lines of code. They sell a lot of low-cost people who then tweak and adjust that to taste and then plop it on the customer and say, all right, here's your thing. That is a very common thing. I came in, I assessed a number of code bases where that was the case. Often they were in serious trouble because the idea was that they would get going quickly and then take over from there. But the body shop came in, did their thing, left. It was a mess. The developers on staff couldn't get it going, etc. So I know that this is a niche because I more than once was in this situation. So your niche could be not, I will do a bunch of code generation, but I'll come in and audit previous code generation. I'll tell you if it's salvageable or not. I'll give you a go forward strategy. I'll fix it. I'll fix the code generator, etc. So you become not the code generation guy as in I will generate code, but the code generation guy as in you probably screwed this up and I'll come in and fix it for you. So that's an interesting niche you could think about. I would say another sort of corollary type thing is, I don't know what you're doing in and around code generation, but like a lot of times code generation is a really like substandard solution, at least philosophically, compared to eliminating the need for code generation. So if, like, for instance, you had a, pay the bill method and it was based on like a US scheme and you added another country to your application in terms of business logic. So right now, all of the, calculation of a bill happened just thinking through a US context. Then you added, say, Canada, and it had slightly different logic. And then later you were going to add Germany and Mexico and Chile. One thing that you could do is create a code generation scheme that would create a new method each time you did this. Another thing would be to use something like polymorphism so that you could just very easily do this through a configuration setting or something, or a rules engine. I'm not going to get too far into the specifics, but one thing you could also think about doing is look at where people have historically solved problems through code generation, and code generation spits out tons of code, which means tons of code maintenance, tons of like source control management and all that, and solve it in a way that doesn't leave that really large sort of sloppy footprint. So you could get really good with code generation and at understanding code generation, but instead of generating more code, solve the problems people have historically solved in that space in a better way. That's going to get kind of hard to sell, but it's super valuable if you can get some testimonials. The last idea here that I'll throw out there is maybe the most true one to what you're talking about, which is how could you actually use this? And the way that I would suggest going about this, the niche that I see here potentially, is you could generate a lot of code, but you could maybe think of finding a sweet spot where you do this in collaboration with low-cost developers in geographic arbitrage situations for startups. And here's what I mean. If you go to, like, there's a Facebook group called SaaS Growth Hacks. If you go to places where aspiring SaaS entrepreneurs hang out, one of the things they're always trying to do is get developers for like $10 an hour to build their ideas. And often their ideas are frankly not that great or profound, or the ideas are very easily addressed or implemented. And what happens to a lot of these startup founders is they shoot their limited budget on a developer who's working for $10 an hour, and that developer is almost certainly manually cranking out CRUD apps or whatever it is. So you could look at a situation where your offering is basically to rocket ship these low-cost pieces of labor, where they're probably reinventing the same kind of wheels over and over again, just with a new developer that just started for $10 an hour. So basically what I'm saying is you could talk to startup founders who are looking to really rapidly prototype their MVPs or whatever it is, and think about a way to abstract really low-cost labor away from them from a development perspective. You handle that pain so they don't have to go out and find these people and wonder if they're getting anything good for $10 an hour. You're going to have a stable of that low-cost labor, and what you're going to do is jumpstart it with code generation and then ask the low-cost labor to just work within the framework you've created. That works well for a reason, because that's why those body shops I mentioned were doing it for large enterprise customers, government contracts, etc. But what you're doing is bringing that same kind of thing to the startup space, where often they are building MVPs. So unlike the enterprises who wind up suing the body shops years later, I'm not making that up. That's something that I've consulted on more than once, where there's anyway. But instead of that, you're really just helping a startup founder get something into place that gets some initial funding or helps them, go raise an additional round or what have you, get some cash flow. So I think that's probably a really good way to actually do that. So yeah, that's what I have to say about the idea of code generation as a niche. It is a tactic. It's not a niche. It's a pretty specialized kind of thing. And whether it's one of my ideas or others, you could brainstorm some things where code generation would help you fill a niche. But it in and of itself isn't a niche. And if you're trying to sell it to people, you are in for a slog, my friend. I have not recorded a proper stock outro for these niche case study videos, so I'm just going to wing it. If you like that, I would love it if you give it a like. Even more so if you were to leave a comment and let me know. I am using this to, determine whether people are responding better to the Reader Question Roundup videos or these, or whether you'd like to see me do something else, so your ideas are welcome. The likes and comments would help me understand that better. If you didn't like it, of course, you can give it a thumbs down. Also comment, yell things at me, do what you've got to do. However you want to engage is naturally your business. If you liked it enough to give it a subscribe, that would be cool too. You can hit the subscribe button, and then there's that bell down below, and it, emails you or pops a notification. I don't know. I honestly don't know what it does when you do that, but it does somehow notify you that I have pushed another video onto the channel. And I will say, as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.